Hi and welcome to the channel. Today we are going to build another SFF PC with the Fractal mode. I bought this for $150 with a $50 shipping fee to the Philippines. In terms of layout, this is a sandwich style case where the motherboard is at the front, beside it is the PSU, while the GPU is at the back. But this is oriented vertically instead of horizontally. It has a fan on the top for exhaust and it has space at the bottom for the supposed to be rear I/O. In terms of volume, this is very similar to the NR200P V2. But the NR200P V2 typically has no air cooler compatibility with its layout. However, the Fractal mode has significantly lesser GPU compatibility as a significant part of its volume went to the 180mm at the top and the I/O space at the bottom. I estimate that this is a total of 4.4 liters in volume or more than 20% of its space. Anyway, upon opening the box, you'd see the user guide and then the accessory box. The case is padded by a thick foam and the case is covered by an anti-dust bag. And this is the case itself. I bought the black case as the gray one was out of stock at the time. And as for a reference of how tall this is, I've placed the S300 beside it, an 8.1 liter case. The S300 is like a toddler as compared to the towering father Fractal mode. At the front, there is an audio jack, USB-C, power switch, and 2 USB-A. Again, at the top, there is a 180mm fan. The sides are pretty much fabric. At the back, there is a mesh. At the bottom, there is a cutout for the motherboard, PCIe slots, and this is the power extension plug. To open the case, you need to pull the flap outwards and then downwards. Remove the 2 screws at the rear and then pull the outer shell upwards. Inside the case, there is a pre-installed riser. As for the cables, there is a USB 3, USB-C, front panel audio, power switch and power LED, and the power extension cable. As for the accessories, it has a 2.5-inch SSD tray, 4 types of screws, zip ties, Velcro straps which I appreciate as it is reusable, and lastly another SSD tray. Going back to the case, there is a writing front and rear to prevent disorientation. As for the build, the first step is to remove the front fan bracket which is secured by 2 screws. After unscrewing, just pull it outwards. Remove the protective foam which is also explicitly stated in the manual, which is very good. Once you clear up the cables, you can now see the motherboard tray. I find this very disorienting at this point, primarily due to the tied up riser as it should be oriented this way. Anyway, as for the motherboard, I'll be using the Asus ROG Strix B650E-I. Processor is a Ryzen 7 7800X3D. RAM is a G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo RGB 32GB 6000 megatransfer CL30 RAM and DeepCool LT520 for the cooler. I also pre-plugged the 24-pin and 8-pin power connectors. Align the motherboard to the screw holes and then I tried to use the usual motherboard screws but it doesn't thread in some standoffs. Given that, I tried the mushroom cap screw and it thread perfectly. To Fractal's credit, the screw to use is stated in the manual which I missed out. After that, plug the riser to the motherboard, plug the front panel audio, USB-C, USB 3, power switch, and power LED. Next is the PSU. As for the PSU, I used the FSP Dagger Pro 850 watts gold power supply. As per the manual, the PSU fan should face the spine of the case, but it will be covered by the GPU. So my instinct is to position the PSU fan facing the front of the case. I think the rationale here is that the front side may be blocked if you use the 3.5-inch drive tray. And Fractal's idea is to compromise by getting hot air from the GPU. But since I'm not going to use the 3.5-inch drive, I positioned the PSU fan facing the front of the case. The PSU fan will then get hot air from the CPU radiator instead. Anyway, screw the PSU to the case, plug the extension cable to the PSU, and then turn on the PSU. Plug the top fan to the case fan header. I then put in the cover of the cooler, and then plug the ARGB to the motherboard. Next is I remove the 3.5-inch drive tray as I need the space for the 240mm radiator. Plug the CPU power connector and the 24-pin power connector to the PSU. At this point, I reoriented the fan from exhaust to intake. But of course, I tested this with exhaust as well. However, I think this is the right orientation for better CPU cooling. I then decided to tie down the cables, but the included Velcro ties are too short, so I strapped 2 of those Velcro ties together to make it longer. Tie down the cables so that it will not be hit by the fan. To mount the cooler, there are 2 types of layout, the C layout and the Z layout or Z layout. At this point, I'm trying to test out a layout that will work. I tried to go against the manual and have the tubes to the PSU side. However, it won't fit that well. After that, I tried to follow the manual where the tubes are at the bottom of the case. This is also more ideal for the AIO. Anyway, I removed the bracket again, and upon checking, I decided to remove the LT520 cover. I did a test fit again, and this is indeed better. I then proceed to screw the radiator mount to the case, and then the radiator to the radiator mount. I checked the fans again if they spin, and it did. Given that, this is actually the best time to do cable management, which is after installing the radiator. Anyway, next is to tackle the GPU. But before that, remove the PCIe covers. As for the GPU, I'll be using the Gigabyte RTX 4070 Ti Super Gaming OC. Just plug this GPU to the riser, screw the GPU baffle to the case, and then plug the 16-pin power connector to the GPU. Lastly is to install the cover of the case. For this, make sure that there are no protruding cables as it will not close. After that, screw the cover of the case, and then install the rear panel. As for the temps, with Cinebench R23, the CPU temps averaged at 89.4 degrees Celsius with and without rear dust filter in intake mode. As compared to the NR200P V2, the Fractal mode is slightly hotter by 0.7 degrees Celsius. With Cinebench R24, the CPU temps averaged at 85.7 degrees Celsius with and without rear dust filter in intake mode. As compared to the NR200P V2, the Fractal mode is slightly hotter by 1 degree Celsius. With FF15 in 4K, for this benchmark, I also tested exhaust mode with and without rear dust filter. The CPU temps ranged from a low 68.57 degrees Celsius in AIO intake without the rear dust filter, while the AIO intake with a rear dust filter isn't that hotter at 69.03 degrees Celsius. That's just 0.46 degrees Celsius difference. In an AIO exhaust config, the difference between with and without dust filter is somewhat negligible at 0.2 degrees Celsius, but these are high temps at 72.51 degrees Celsius to 72.71 degrees Celsius. As compared with NR200P V2, NR200P V2 sits directly in between the multiple configurations. As for the GPU temps, this is one of the most polarized results that I've got in a long time. In an AIO intake with a rear dust filter, the temps averaged at 69.21 degrees Celsius, but without a rear dust filter, the temps averaged at 64.28 degrees Celsius. That's nearly 5 degrees Celsius cooler. The difference is similar in an AIO exhaust config, but the GPU is slightly cooler by 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius as compared to its intake configuration. As compared to the NR200P V2 that has a dust filter as well, the mood is just 0.45 degrees Celsius cooler without a rear dust filter, and 4.42 degrees Celsius hotter with a dust filter. In a somewhat parity config, the mood is 1 degree Celsius cooler with a rear dust filter and still 3.43 degrees Celsius hotter with a dust filter alone. As to how I interpret the results, Fractal made a very bad dust filter. The NR200P V2 has a dust filter as well, but it wasn't as hot. I think it's best to remove the dust filter as suggested by the manual if you want a cooler configuration. While I didn't have time to test another config, which is an intake top fan instead of its default exhaust config, I'd currently recommend an AIO intake config. This is a good balance between CPU and GPU temps. Especially that this is a sandwich style layout, you'd want intake for CPU and let the exhaust fans expel the internal heat. As for my comments to the case, this is the easiest Fractal ITX build that I've done. If I look back at my Ridge video, it took 30 plus screws to build. And with Terra, I had to remove the riser completely for me to build. The unibody shell is interesting at first, but it's not something that I would look forward to in the future. I still prefer push-pin side panels though, as I find them easier whenever there's a small change in configuration. But again, mood is a huge step in terms of ease of build as compared to Ridge and Terra. Next is the dust filter. I really think they should redesign this. If Cooler Master was just 1 degree Celsius hotter, I think Fractal can do it too. Next is the manual, which is very good and around 99.5% accurate. The only miss that I can point out is the PSU screw, which I didn't find one in my case. Again, if it wasn't for the manual, I wouldn't have tried to remove the dust filter at the back, which really improved GPU thermal performance. There's also a cleaning guide, and while it wasn't explicit on what tool you should use, I think this is a lint roller. My biggest issue though is its size to compatibility ratio. For this big, I would have asked for a full 3-slot GPU compatibility. And if Fractal wants to create a performance case other than just creating proper mesh panels and calling it a day, they could also provide air vents on the sides of the case, even if it's just on the GPU side of the case. I noticed that when running games, it was quite hot to touch on both sides. While there is really an active exhaust, that won't be enough with big GPUs, as big GPUs tend to have vertical fin stack orientation, meaning that air will go up and down the GPU, and in this case to the side of the case, which is blocked. Having an active exhaust 325mm away means that some of the hot air would have recirculated already. As for my tips to buyers, if you're buying this case for aesthetics, I think the black one is too plain and I suggest getting the gray one instead. But that's simply an opinion. Next is that you might want to put some space between your PC and your wall, as the GPU will get its fresh air from the rear instead of the usual side and occasional front. Overall, I think it's okay. It's not a hard recommendation considering the price, but I think you'd buy this for aesthetics anyway rather than anything else, which is again priceless. Anyway, that's it for this video. Do let me know in the comments below on what you think of this case. Thanks for watching. Do like or dislike and subscribe for more unboxing, SFF builds, and benchmarks. Bye!